from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. It's going to become a different strategic risk assessment talk. I'm going to look at a number of different things. I know I've done that in the past, but recently I've kind of focused on one thing. Of course, recently I talked to Fox Live Now anchor. He would say Live Now by Fox, Andrew Kraft, and we talked about a number of different things. But I'm going to talk about a number of strategic risk issues across the global front, if you will, the battle lines of wars and conflicts going on. And the first one I'm going to talk about is kind of what's been breaking in the news and has gotten everybody's attention, which is that you may have seen that Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, had ordered strikes on Yemen. And apparently, from everything that's been said, this was decided some weeks back to look at doing some sort of plan to do big strikes. So this is not something they just came up with. It doesn't appear to be any sort of knee-jerk sort of thing. But you may recall that early in the administration, they had redesignated the Houthis, Houthi rebels in Yemen, as terrorists. Why the Biden administration had decertified them, that's a completely different discussion. I'm not going to go into that. But they have been certified as terrorists. If they are certified as a terrorist group and that they are terrorists, that kind of frees the hand of striking their leadership structure. That frees the hand of going after individual targets, if you will, and I mean by that individuals, key individuals within the Houthi leadership. Now, when you go after leadership targets, it is not uncommon you're going to take collateral damage. If you hit them at where their homes, there very well may be their families there and things like that. That's it's a sad but true nature of warfare that when you go after, and certainly counterterrorism, that they tend to surround themselves with those who are really not that, I don't know how to say completely innocent, but not that guilty. Of course, if it's children, they are innocent, but they surround themselves with others. Anyway, that decision to make them terrorists had been made, which kind of opened up the targeting profile of what could potentially be hit within the Houthi territories. The U.S. airstrikes were in response to a new warning by the group that after the end of the March 1 or March 1st ceasefire in Gaza, the phase 1 that just basically led to phase nothing, there was no extension on phase 1 and there was no phase 2, that they were going to resume targeting ships and maritime commerce going through the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, and the critical Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Well, that was just not something that the U.S. was going to sit idle, nor anybody else sit idle on, and just let happen. So that's when the concerted planning on this began, and it is fairly significant. Now, President Trump warned the Houthis in a social media post that, quote, "Hell will rain down on you like nothing you have ever seen before," unquote. All right, it's pretty strong language, although for President Trump, not unusual language per se, but he'd use that. By the way, he'd use that kind of language similar, not exactly the same, with Hamas, and that led to the ceasefire being imposed or being implemented, if you recall. So that kind of language does seem to resonate, certainly within parts of the Middle East. The strikes mark the largest operations seen in the Middle East since President Trump has returned to the White House for his second term. They're fairly significant. What he also has said is, quote, to Iran, support for Houthi terrorists must end immediately, unquote. And he put that on his true social media. And he said, quote, America will hold you fully accountable, and we won't be nice about it. I find that language kind of interesting, to say the least. So I guess the days of just indecisive or ambivalent strikes and nice attacks have ended, I guess. I could, if I was to read into that. But what I will say is this. The strikes have been hitting, obviously, a variety of military targets throughout Yemen. They've also been hitting key leadership targets throughout Yemen. My understanding is they may have struck, I don't know if they I don't know if the battle damage assessment is in, but they apparently targeted the head of their rocket forces. Those who have been launching drones and rockets, the person most responsible for launching drones and rockets against maritime shipping. That's a sort of personalized attack. And certainly, if you look at what happened with Hezbollah and up in Yemen, up in Lebanon, and you looked at what happened in Gaza when key leadership targets were taken out, it doesn't completely deflate their sails, so to speak, but it does take a lot of wind out of their sails. And with Hezbollah, it really took the wind out of their sails when key leadership targets, leaders were taken out. It kind of left these organizations a little bit adrift, and they couldn't quite get their footing again after this happened. And I think that same methodology, that same thinking is here. Look, the Houthis have been around for a while. Their leadership structure is fairly well ingrained, and it's not like they change leaders on a regular basis and things like that. So with all that said, their ability to move this around in this way is a little bit, to make this sort of impact with going after these targets is a little bit stronger. Now, what is different? Well, the Biden administration had a different methodology. They would tend to attack missile launchers. In many cases, their attacks seemed to be when they were getting ready to launch drones and missiles, then they would go in and attack. Now, there was a famous attack involving B-2 bombers that appears to have gone after some of the underground bunkers, if you will, where they store their drones and missiles and things like that. And that was due to a particular type of bomb, for lack of a better term, that we can carry on a B-2 that we can't carry on other types of aircraft. So there have been some big strikes, but we have avoided, for a number of reasons, going after the leadership targets, I think primarily because of the concern about collateral damage. That concern doesn't appear to be dominant in these strikes. The Trump strikes, if you will, are aimed at debilitating the command and control of the Houthis. In some ways, some of that social fabric that holds them together. And my guess is that when they were coming up with the strike list, it was probably a very interesting group that was in the room. Now, I've spent a lot of times in what's called joint planning groups or, some sort of operational planning group or planning team or something like that, where we look at a lot of things. And many times in those planning efforts, we will bring in, particularly when we're looking at a lot of different factors, we'll bring in folks from other agencies. In cases, we'll bring in folks from academia that could provide some input into the planning process to give us an idea of ends and means, or ends, ways, means, I should say, across the board. And the Trump end state also appears to be different. Certainly, this is aimed at basically debilitating, if not destroying, the ability of the Houthis to pose a threat to shipping. But it also appears to be a big message to Iran. And certainly with Iran, there's a lot of things they have to consider. You got to remember, they watched their surrogates, if you will. They watched their sub-organizations, the sort of thing that they've been doing throughout the region, where they have their surrogates like, Hamas in Gaza and a little bit in the West Bank. And then they had Hezbollah as this big force in Lebanon, also supporting Bashar Assad in Syria, and certainly the Houthis down in Yemen. And they have a few others, but all of these things have seen major setbacks. I mean, the Hamas is basically been devastated by what's happened with Israel, with Israel's strikes on it. Certainly well beyond what Hamas had ever envisioned that Israel would do. Certainly Hezbollah has been, they're now in a ceasefire situation, and they have been devastated by what's happened in Israel. And of course, the Bashar Assad regime no longer exists. They've been completely wiped out. And Iranian influence in Syria, which is the land bridge, if you will, that gets support to Hezbollah, has been breached completely. So for Iran, their ability to do things was really kind of limited up north. I mean, yes, they have a lot of influence with some of these Iraqi groups, but even that situation has been changing quite a bit behind the scenes. So they got the Houthis, and now the Houthis are being attacked in a way that threatens their existence. So for Iran, they're hitting a kind of a strategic inflection point, if you will, in terms of their landscape of what they can do through these basically proxy groups that they've been supporting for so many years throughout the region. So it's changing their entire strategy. At the same time, they've been belligerent as all get out on talking about, they're not going to enter into nuclear talks, and they're going to, rain hell down on Israel at some point, things like that. Well, yeah, that's one thing to say that stuff. It's another thing to try and actually do anything with it. And so they're very limited in terms of what they can actually accomplish with what they have. And they're going to get more limited, certainly as these strikes and the Houthis continue. So that's a big change. Now, recall when the war began in Gaza on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched those attacks. Recall that in November, the Houthis started attacking shipping. About 12% of global trade goes to the Suez Canal. About 30% of container traffic went through the Suez Canal. Over $1 trillion worth of commerce, worth of goods in the global economy went through the Suez Canal. About 50 ships a day. I think the last thing I saw was about 56 ships a day at its height were going through the Suez Canal. So there's a lot of shipping that was going through the Suez Canal, and that was all impacted. More than 70% of all that within a year was shut down. And actually, lots of shipping organizations or shipping companies around the world have been diverting their shipping around the Horn of Africa. It's like 2 to 3 weeks more shipping time, a lot more cost to the cost of goods sold by the time it gets to wherever it's got to go. A lot of those ships that would have gone through the Suez Canal, they actually take them the other way around the world, and they'll go through the Panama Canal or some other way to get to wherever they got to go. So it's been an incredibly disruptive thing that has caused damage to the global economy across the board. By the way, that over 70%. You also have to realize Egypt is dramatically impacted. They get a huge chunk of their government revenue from proceeds from the Suez Canal. So when that shipping drops, the revenues that go to the government that pay for things like the Egyptian military are dramatically impacted. And whereas Egypt, certainly on a political level, really has no desire to get drawn into a ground war in Yemen, in terms of what they can do, that's probably something that at some point in the future they may have to think about. And it may be something that the Trump administration may actually talk to them about, is that Egyptians provide boots on the ground, along with maybe the Saudis going back into Yemen to deal with the Houthis in a very decisive sort of ground war kind of way. All right, so now let's talk about Gaza, if you will. Steve Witkoff, the emissary envoy from President Trump to both the Middle East and also to the Russo-Ukraine war. He is in Doha. He came back there about a week ago. What would it be, around the week of the 7th, maybe something like that. 8th, the week of the 8th. Anyway, March 8th. He went into Doha to talk to the mediators working on the ceasefire negotiations. He'd come in with some proposals. One of the things that's kind of shifted with the Trump administration is it was revealed that the U.S. had been talking directly to Hamas, and that there was a big push by President Trump to get all the U.S. hostages released, first and foremost. And this is a kind of a bit of a change, that the U.S. is prioritizing the release of U.S. citizens that are held hostage. Some of those are actually members of the Israeli Defense Forces. They are fighting for Israel, but they are also U.S. citizens as well. So that appears to have been something they have been pushing. Now, the phase 2 negotiations, that would have resulted in the release of all the hostages and a withdrawal of Israeli Defense Forces from Gaza, has gone nowhere. The current ceasefire has, as mentioned before, has basically ended on March 1st. Israel stopped in fairly short order all aid going into Gaza as these negotiations were going on. The aid flowing into Gaza was a condition of the previous ceasefire, so they stopped all aid to put pressure on Hamas. Hamas has been belligerent as ever. They pushed back on Witkoff's proposal for maybe a 30-day ceasefire. And I think originally they were talking about 10. I've heard more recently it's up to 11 hostages being released, and somewhere around half of the deceased hostages remains being released as well. And that this thing might go till like March 20th, maybe. I think that's the 30-day thing, and the thinking on that is maybe it would start, April 20th, and it would start on March 20th. And I think that's part of that 30-day sort of thinking, that they could somehow get this into place. I'm sure whenever it ends would be 30 days, based on everything I've seen so far, 30 days after whenever the start date would be. And I don't know when that start date might be. In the meantime, Israel did a fairly significant strike in northern Gaza. It was striking what they said were 6 Hamas or PIJ, it's not quite clear, but 6 Hamas terrorists that were planning to do a drone operation. Hamas came back and said that it's, oh no, these were aid workers, and all they did was kill a bunch of aid workers. Obviously, I got to tell you, anything Hamas says, I'm highly skeptical of. And I don't think, certainly at this juncture, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, would strike a bunch of random aid workers, which is what Hamas is trying to make it sound like, that there was a cruel strike against unarmed aid workers who are simply trying to help the people. Look, this is right out of the propaganda playbook of how to completely mischaracterize or basically fabricate what actually happened. So, yeah, I think they were going after a drone operation that they were trying to launch into Israel, and it was probably a good strike. But it does bring back to the issue, there is no ceasefire. And Israel is poised to go back into Gaza. If that happens, they will probably have to push the Gazans south again. And these are a traumatized population. I'm not quite sure exactly how that will work. I mean, at some point they have to save their lives, so they got to get out of the zone, if you will, the zone of conflict. They're going to have to move, but they are traumatized, and I think part of this is the dimension of, as long as the Palestinian residents of Gaza allow Hamas to rule Gaza, and the reality is that if they actually were to somehow collectively get together, they could probably influence the ability of Hamas to control the ground in Gaza. But so far, they have shown a complete lack of willingness to do anything. In fact, when the ceasefire came in, many of the residents were on the streets cheering and yelling, and there was a lot of discussion about how this was a great victory for Hamas. And then when the hostages are being released, you saw some of these just really incredibly offensive release events where they put them up on stage, they make them talk, they make them thank their captors. In one case, it looked like they had been starved for a very long period of time. I think President Trump said they looked like they had survivors of the Holocaust or something. So all of this, and of course, in one case, they were released and the crowd was literally surging around them, and Hamas wasn't holding them off very well. Look, this really, really looked bad. And if it was the goal of Hamas to inflame passions within Israel, to steal their resolve to destroy Hamas, mission accomplished. All right. They brought that on themselves, but at some point, I think the Palestinians in Gaza are going to have to figure this out. Now, meantime, there's been some discussion pop up in the news about if the Trump plan, which is to rebuild Gaza by taking all the Palestinian residents and putting them someplace else, if that comes into place, where would they go? And this, recently I'd heard in the past there had been talk about sending Hamas to Sudan, which I find interesting. It's in the middle of a civil war. The talk was displacing the Palestinians to potentially Sudan, Somalia, Somaliland, which technically is part of Somalia, but it's actually a separate autonomous controlled area. In fact, of all the Somalia area, that area it is recognized by, I think, 1 or 2 countries in the world as a separate country. The U.S. doesn't recognize it as a separate country, but Somaliland. Anyway, that was put out there as a possibility, kind of an interesting idea. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on with that. Negotiations continue. We'll see if anything comes of it. Syria, really big events in Syria have taken place. The Syrian Democratic Front, SDF, it's a Kurdish-backed organization. It is the group that the U.S. has been working with so closely over the many years going after ISIS. They have reached an agreement with the new government to meld their forces in. It's a huge thing, and of course this falls right on the heels of the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, if you will, within Turkey. Their leader, who's been behind bars forever, said, "Hey, it's time to stop. Lay down your arms. Ceasefire. Truce. We need to stop fighting for independence for Kurdistan." Within Turkey, major victory for President Erdogan in Turkey when that happened. And with that, they implored their Kurdish cousins, if you will, to the south within Syria. And the PKK has, reportedly had a presence working in northern Syria for quite some time. So with that, they implored them. At first, the SDF wasn't interested, but whatever negotiations came out of this, it sounds like the SDF will be merging in. And all of this comes in the wake of those clashes that recently happened with the Alawites and the government forces, where about 700 people were killed, many of them innocent women and children, old people, people who are non-combatants by every stretch of however that's described, and certainly seen as a very tragic event, but certainly also seen as an impediment towards building this larger coalition around the new government that brings in everybody. Certainly they want to bring in the Alawites into the new government, and of course this is a real stumbling block towards that end. However, having the Kurds step in, if you look at the map, that's a big chunk of the territory that the SDF controlled. The other thing, too, is it brings into question the U.S. presence. If the SDF, our primary ally in Syria on counter-ISIS operations, is now part of the new government, it's going to cause a reevaluation of why does the U.S. continue to have a presence, physical presence on the ground in Syria. At some point, will we want to pull them back? Now, part of this goes into what is this new government? All right, who are these guys? And this gets into Shura, all right, who previously was called Mohammed al-Julani. He was the head of the al-Nusra Front. The al-Nusra Front was an al-Qaeda organization. They refused to merge with ISIS years back under Julani's leadership. He said, nope, I'm not going to merge with ISIS. They set themselves up as a separate organization. They had an ongoing conflict with ISIS over the many years. So they were certainly opposed to the Shiite, Alawite-dominated Assad government, but they were also fighting ISIS at the same time. But they were part of al-Qaeda. And then in more recent years, it rolled into this larger HTS conglomeration that eventually went in there and rolled south and overthrew the Assad government. But it's certainly for Israel, certainly for the U.S., we are definitely not comfortable with the idea of, we didn't like Bashar Assad. We hated that regime. It was simply really a proxy of Iran exporting violent actions, if you will, paramilitary terrorist actions throughout the region through its proxies, supporting Hezbollah. Obviously, nothing good with that. However, to have them replaced by someone who used to be a senior leader in the al-Qaeda organization, that's not exactly a comforting thought either. And so the question is what to do. Where do we go with this? And now our primary ally on counter-ISIS operations is rolling into a coalition government, whereupon the leader is the former head of al-Qaeda in Syria. To say there's a strategic conundrum is to put it lightly. All right. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about Kursk and Ukraine. And I got to tell you, I'm a little frustrated with some of the headlines. All right. Yes. The Ukrainians are pulling out of Kursk. I mean, Kursk is a Russian oblast. It's a Russian province, if you will. This was some months back, this surprise thing where The Ukrainians burst into Russian territory, seized Russian territory in Kursk, caught the Russians completely off guard. The Russians were trying to pull forces in to deal with the Ukrainian incursion. The Ukrainians made a lot of territorial gains in Kursk. Eventually, Russia reached out to the North Koreans. The North Koreans sent troops in there to fight the Ukrainians in Kursk. As you may recall, North Korea and Russia had previously signed a mutual defense agreement. So under the terms of that agreement, putting North Korean troops into Kursk would kind of fit because it was actually Russian territory. And the North Koreans took phenomenal losses, 3,000 to 4,000 troops killed. I think just a handful, a very small group of North Korean troops that were actually captured. And then Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, eventually ordered summary executions of the families in North Korea of those troops who had allowed themselves to be captured. All right. And that's kind of how Kim Jong-un does things. All right. And apparently, all reports are that he had given orders that nobody was to be taken prisoner by the Ukrainians, that they were supposed to die first. And I'm sure there were suicide orders with that as well. That's kind of a North Korean thing that they do. Anyway, so that's kind of what's gone on there. The Russians have taken phenomenal losses fighting the Ukrainians in Kursk. Now, Kursk doesn't have a lot of great terrain to fight. It's really flat. Flat terrain favors armored forces, but it also, if you're in the defender, your enemy has to have 3-to-1 or 5-to-1 superiority normally, at least 3-to-1 to normally overwhelm you. And the Ukrainians had thought this through. They had very good lines. Now, the U.S. cut off intelligence support to Ukraine while the last part of this Russian offensive was going. A lot of discussion in the news that this loss of intelligence is what allowed the Russians to capitalize on it and push them out. A lot of discussion that the Ukrainian forces were being encircled, they're going to get cut off and wiped out. That never happened. The Ukrainians did pull back. They did lose some equipment, but with that said, they got their forces out and pulled back. So all of this is being framed as a great loss for the Ukrainians. All of this is being framed politically as part of the reasons that Ukraine should agree to just about anything to end this war. Here's the reality. Why did the Ukrainians go into Kursk? This was classic maneuver warfare. This is classic fourth-generation warfare, if you will, because they were getting pushed back in the Donbas. The Russians were taking horrendous losses for marginal gains in the Donbas, but they were moving in on some key cities, Pokrovsk being one of them, and they were going to go in there and take that critical crossroads city, and they were making great gains. Simply put, the Russians had not defended Kursk very well. There were some forces up there, but not much, and they realized that there was a vulnerability with the Russian lines, which is they were defending everywhere they were in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine, they weren't defending as well. So they saw an opportunity, and they shot north into Kursk. That put Putin in a very difficult position. He had to find a way to defend Russian territory from the Ukrainians. And eventually, he did pull forces from elsewhere on the Ukrainian front to include the Donbas, which took pressure off the Donbas, off that critical area where they've been making gains. And eventually, the Ukrainians were not only able to successfully defend it for the Russians, they were actually able to push them back and retake some villages and towns that they had lost previously. So strategically, that actually was a very successful operation. It actually did exactly what they wanted it to do. It's kind of over, but it actually did buy time and space for the Ukrainians in the Donbas. So with all that said, the numbers are not favoring Russia. Russia right now, if the numbers continue, their total losses for this war are going to be up to 900,000. 900,000 troops lost in this war. It is a phenomenal loss. We're talking World War I, World War II type of numbers. Tremendous losses. The North Koreans have come in, have also suffered tremendous losses. And so with that said, yes, in a larger sense, it looks like Zelensky's going to agree to the minerals agreement, stuff like that. But the Russians are also facing some big things. If the numbers continue where they are, if they keep taking these losses, if no ceasefire is put in place, before the end of June, Russia's losses, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, will have surpassed 1 million men during this war. Phenomenal losses. And no, the Ukrainian losses are not commensurate with that. I know that was put out there as somehow that they were equal or Ukraine was losing more. Hey, don't get me wrong. This war is a phenomenal manpower problem for Ukraine. They have got issues. They've got some internal political issues they have to take care of as well in terms of their manpower problem. However, with that said, it is one thing to note that Putin is realizing he's got pressure on this as well. All right, with all that said, covered a lot of material. Thank you for sitting through this. And certainly, if you didn't get this through going through the stratpodcast.com, please do. Also, you can go to Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube to track what I'm doing. And thanks for listening in.